Thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us. 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, but to the point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
South Africa.
This was turned up really high.
Inaya Folarin. Big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. This week, a leaked document claims that the US Supreme Court is now in favour of overturning Roe versus Wade, potentially putting women's abortion rights in peril. We discuss what this means and why it matters. And non-NATO European countries such as Sweden and Finland debate whether to join NATO to defend themselves against potential Russian aggression. We discuss what this could mean. And from the local elections this week in the UK to the midterm elections in the US later in the year, we ask, are voters' interests being represented and served? I'm also joined in the studio throughout the show by editor of Spiked Online Tom Slater and arts consultant Manik Govinda. But first, here's the latest headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 3 p.m. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Deputy Prime Minister has vowed to reform the Northern Ireland Protocol to improve stability in Northern Ireland following Sinn Féin's success in the Stormont elections. The party won 27 seats, overtaking the DUP, which dropped down to 25. The region has been without a power-sharing executive for several months after the DUP refused to be involved in protest over the post-Brexit protocol agreement. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, explained the next steps in Stormont.
Well, politicians here in Belfast following Sinn Féin's historic victory are going to have to start making decisions, and soon, because they're under pressure from governments around the world, including the British and Irish governments and the US government, to get the power-sharing executive at Stormont back up and running again. There is expected to be talks held in Stormont tomorrow, but frankly, we may be waiting for a while for Stormont to be properly up and running. Why is that? It's because the DUP are reticent to go back into power with Sinn Féin, while the Northern Ireland Protocol remains. That deal that was done between the UK and the EU on the future of Northern Ireland and trades, unionists feel it divides Great Britain from the rest of Northern Ireland. They want to see it scrapped or changed fundamentally. Is that likely to happen anytime soon? It seems unlikely, and that is why I think it's possible that Northern Ireland will be without executive for a prolonged period of time. It could be quite a while before Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin takes up that position as First Minister of Northern Ireland, an historic first.
In Ukraine, fighters at the besieged Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol have vowed to continue fighting as long as they're alive. President Zelensky says all 300 women, children and elderly people have been rescued from the steelworks, leaving only fighters in the plant. The deputy commander of the regiment, who is sheltering, says they don't have much time left as they're under intense attack.
All this time, we're under heavy shelling by air, under heavy shelling by naval forces, by tanks, under artillery shelling, shelling by multiple rocket launchers, under constant rocket shelling. We're ordinary boys holding rifles and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. I don't know how to compare it. These are soldiers who carried out and keep carrying out their duties. They need to be evacuated. They need proper conditions. They need to get proper medical treatment, which they deserve.
Well, the Foreign Secretary has accused Russia of war crimes after a bomb destroyed a school in Luhansk in which 90 people were sheltering. Writing on social media, Liz Truss said the deliberate targeting of civilians and infrastructure amounts to war crimes. The governor of Luhansk says at least 2 people have been killed, with 60 others remain buried under rubble and feared dead.
An aircraft bomb went into a school. Unfortunately, it's completely destroyed. Right now, emergency service workers are clearing the debris, but there were 60 people hiding from the shelling. The school was destroyed completely. Considering it was an aircraft bomb, the temperature was wild. Of course, the emergency services workers will try to clear the debris as fast as they can, but the chances of people still being alive are small. But we hope for the best.
Senior Tories are accusing Sir Keir Starmer of hypocrisy as new details emerged into allegations that he broke lockdown rules last year. The Mail on Sunday has published a leaked memo which appears to suggest that a beer and curry event attended by the Labour leader and his deputy Angela Rayner was pre-planned. Sir Keir insists that no lockdown rules were broken. However, police in Durham are investigating. Sir Keir is resisting calls to resign, despite previously saying that the Prime Minister should step down over parties held at Number 10. Hong Kong has elected its new chief executive. John Lee, the sole candidate, was endorsed for the city's top job by a pro-Beijing committee. Lee said it was his historic mission to lead a new chapter for Hong Kong. The former Secretary for Security was responsible for implementing China's national security law to arrest pro-democracy demonstrators and shut down liberal media outlets. A bridge has collapsed in northern Pakistan, swept away by water from a melted glacier. A recent heatwave caused huge amounts of water to run into the stream in Hassanabad and surrounding areas. Local media quote experts saying the water volume at the Shispa Glacier lake increased by 40% over the past 20 days. A further 33 glacial lakes are at risk of bursting soon. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return to the discussion.
Good afternoon and welcome to The Discussion, which explores the moral implications of the stories that matter to you. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio throughout the show by editor of Spiked Online, Tom Slater, and arts consultant, Manik Govinda. Now, one can say that there are only two questions in politics: who decides and who decides who decides. This week, we inquire over the several ways in which the individual and collective right to be the master of one's own destiny are being imperilled or asserted around the world. In the US, a leaked document claims that the US Supreme Court is now in favour of overturning Roe versus Wade, the case which made abortion legal across the US in 1973. But a poll of the American public taken immediately after the leak found that a plurality of 50% of Americans do not support overturning the landmark case. A decision to overturn could instantly make abortion illegal in 22 states. But who should be responsible for this decision? The Supreme Court, states, or neither? Is this debate solely a question of a woman's right to choose, or is there more going on here? Next, as Russia's ruinous war in Ukraine continues, several Western countries continue to supply weapons and send billions of dollars into Ukraine. Previously neutral non-NATO European countries such as Sweden and Finland face a dilemma as to whether to join NATO to defend themselves against potential Russian aggression. Is a consensus emerging that the upholding of national sovereignty may require an international collective defence? And in the last few years, voters have found a range of ways to express their discontent, from the populist revolt of Brexit to the mass demonstrations of civil disobedience by Canadian truckers. But a sense of frustration and impotence still characterise the feelings of many voters. Thus, we ask, how can citizens transform society? Finally, in today's last segment, I speak to two very special guests about how they are finding ways to navigate these thorny issues in a challenging and thought-provoking way. Stay with us until the end of the show to find out, and also send your views on the big discussions we're having by email to gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. In this week's edition of In Focus, where we take a deeper look at a prominent news story of the week, we're exploring the controversy surrounding Roe versus Wade, after a leaked document revealed that the US Supreme Court is now in favour of overturning the case, which made abortion legal across the US in 1973. We're exploring why this case is important and what is potentially at stake here. I'm delighted to be joined by Anne Frady, former Chief Executive of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service and author of Moral Case for Choice, Michael Phillips, Christian Legal Centre lawyer. Thank you both for joining me. First, I'll start with you, Anne. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what is going on in America right now surrounding abortion and why you think this should matter to the people of the UK, if you think it should?
Well, one of the things that I think has happened in the United States, which is a real problem, is that abortion is really seen as an identity issue. And so consequently, it's identified by Republicans in particular as being something that nasty women do. I think that what is being missed with the Supreme Court decision is a hugely important question of who decides on abortion. And the underlying principle of the ruling back in the 70s was that abortion was a private decision because a woman was making a decision about what was going on with her own body and the composition of her own family. And when we say a private decision, we mean one that's outside of the ruling of the state. And weirdly, what the Supreme Court has done is to make the intensely personal decision about what happens with your pregnancy part of a public decision. And that has just got to be wrong. Whatever the technicality is, it's got to be wrong for our private lives, those inner decisions about our own bodies that we make according to our conscience, to be a matter of the ruling of someone else. And that was what was great about the American Constitution, was that it held that principle.
And Michael, do you take issue with anything Anne has said there?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that this is a good decision, and because the way in which Roe versus Wade, 1973, legalized abortion across America was just wrong in terms of their own constitution. This is a step in the right direction for the rule of law. It's a step in the right direction for democracy, because the way the American Constitution works is that individual states make the decision as to whether certain issues like this are legal or illegal. That is how the Constitution works. And then what we have back in 1973 is unelected lawyers making a decision that was reserved for the states, and at the very most, maybe the Senate. So for nearly 200 years, that's the way that the American Constitution worked. And this drove a coach and horses through the way in which the law worked. And it was an egregious decision. And that word egregious has not been used to describe many decisions. But this, it appears as though the justices are saying it is an egregious contravention of the way the law works. And so we are now returning to something which is at the very least, democratic.
Michael, I guess some people would push back that, for example, some people regard abortion rights to be, a fundamental right, a question of body autonomy, and that should not necessarily be a decision for states, for majoritarian decisions, such as, for example, many facets of the Constitution cannot be changed, for example, on a state-to-state basis. And one of those things, i.e. abortion, should be included in that. Why should it be any different?
The Constitution in America and also the Constitution in this country recognizes the right to life is the most fundamental human right that a society can protect. If you think about the millions of pounds that are spent by the police in relation to one prosecution for murder, then you think about the fact that approximately 200,000 people every year are aborted in this country, and there's no investigation, there's nothing that happens. And the only reason why they are killed is because ultimately it comes down to the will of a mother. If, for example, the father or anybody else had gone up to the mother and had assaulted her, resulting in the death of a child, that person could have faced a charge of infanticide as well as assault on the mother. However, if the intention changes, then nobody is concerned whatsoever.
But in truth, Michael, even in the UK, this issue is not politicised in the same way that it is in America. According to a YouGov poll, only 9 in 10 people in the UK believe that women should have access to abortion. So most people don't see it in the way that you see it, at least in the UK.
Well, it depends what question you ask will then generate the answer that maybe the person who has commissioned the questionnaire in the first place wishes to obtain. I think that most people in this country want a rowing back of the abortion rights that are in existence at the moment. And what we have seen in the last few weeks is we have seen a wide-scale liberalisation, which not only puts, whatever your views are in relation to abortion and whether the fetus is a person or not, it puts women at risk in this country with the legalisation of DIY abortions. And that is a very sad indictment on our society. I think, one of the popes once said that you can tell a lot by society how it treats its most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable person in our society is that person which is inside the womb. And that's how we treat 200,000 people every year in the society.
OK, well, according to several polls, including another YouGov poll, a plurality of people do think that the 24-week limit in the UK is about right. But just coming back to you, Anne, I mean, what do you say to that point about it should be a democratic question? The fact that it has become so politicised in America is that it has been a fragile consensus, that many people have been expecting that at some point Roe versus Wade would unravel because the question of privacy is just not strong enough for some people. And actually, this should really be fought on a democratic level, on a state-to-state level. Why should it be a decision for lawyers?
So I think there are two different issues, really, and they get wrapped up in this in a way that I think you're right is not terribly helpful and makes a huge muddle out of it. Yes, it's right that on a state-by-state basis, elected representatives should decide on what the abortion law should be. I agree with that. However, as we've accepted, the Constitution sits back from those state-by-state laws, and in some ways you could say it kind of, sets out those underlying principles that makes America a country. They're things that society generally agrees with. And that right to privacy, that is crucial to that. Now, Michael and I will hugely disagree with how that will be interpreted. I will say that when we think about the morals of abortion and the right and wrongs of it, and this is what I try and explore in my book, we don't always start from the point of view of the embryo and the fetus. We start from the point of view of the woman and her ability to make a private decision. Now, that's really what underlaid the court's ruling. Now we have a court that is dominated because of appointments that were made by President Trump, by people who are much more disposed to agree with Michael. And let's face it, the decision about abortion largely is not whether it's constitutional or whether it's democratic. It's whether or not someone thinks it's right or it's wrong. Michael thinks it's wrong in all circumstances. I just don't know whether an individual's decision is right or wrong, but what I do know is absolutely right, is that she should be able to make that decision for herself because it's her body, her family, and her life.
Mm. And also, Michael, I mean, what do you say to those that there seems to be a lot of the time in the pro-life perspective, overemphasis on the embryo or the fetus, for example, ignoring or perhaps trivialising the moral capability of women to be able to decide for themselves decisions that fundamentally alter the course of their own life? Where do you place women in all of this and the fact that they have to bear the burden of pregnancy?
Women are very much at the heart of this debate. And what happens is that very often what the pro-life organizations in this country in America try to do is present women with all the facts so that they can make an informed decision as to whether their choice to what they are doing is going to be a good thing or a bad thing.
You're talking about an informed decision, but you still only want them to be allowed to make one decision.
I think what it comes down to is that a society will change its laws based upon the culture that exists at the time. And unless pro-life activists are able to win over the population, it's unlikely that the law will change. And even if the law is changed in America on a federal level, then there will be battles and continuing battles at a state level. But I think the problem is that there's been a lot of misinformation and fake news out there, whereby when people are told certain things about the fetus and the fact that it's not really a person. And I think, Anne and I will probably agree that the fetus is just Latin for small person. It is a person. It does die, and it involves the death of a person. And when people understand the full reality as to what abortion is, very often people will make the opposite decision as to what we expect them to make. So women do have to be absolutely at the heart of this decision, but they, when they are given the full facts, will very often choose not to go through with abortions.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much both for joining me. Michael Phillips, Christian Legal Centre lawyer, and Anne Frady, former Chief Executive of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service and author of The Moral Case for Choice. Thank you both for joining me. I'm just going to bring in Tom Slater and Manik Govinda. First, I'll start with you, Tom. I mean, even though this debate has become incredibly heated and contested, the truth is that, for example, in the UK, that there is a kind of broad consensus on it. But there isn't a consensus, if we're completely honest, with removing restrictions as a whole. So according to many polls, most people think it's about right at 24 weeks, and actually about 24% think it should be reduced, and only a small minority think it should be increased. So in some sense, there is an acceptance that even though people support women's right to control their own body when it comes to abortion, there is still, even in the UK, a kind of uncomfortable discomfort with the idea of extending it further.
There is a discomfort, but I think in part that's also because of the fact that the issue has been broadly depoliticised. I think it's thought of, largely speaking, as a settled matter. It's thought of as an issue of healthcare, essentially, at this point. It's not nearly as inflamed. And I think that those choice campaignners who want to actually see the laws more liberalised, to take this completely out of the criminal law, to get to a situation in which women can exercise their proper bodily autonomy, will need to actually have out that argument. I mean, it's something that Anne Frady's been doing for many, many years. But I think in some sense, the kind of the desire to protect what we have, if you like, in relation to the rights that already exist and the laws that already exist, can sometimes breed a level of tentativeness elsewhere in this discussion for fear of, again, going down the road that somewhere like America has gone down recently.
No, exactly. And Manik, I mean, what do you think? Just quickly, I mean, do you think that this case in America, or this whole situation, could have implications here? Should we be worried about it? Because there is often a worry that whatever culture wars happens in America, in a few years' time, it's eventually going to come to the UK.
Well, yes, what happens in America does have an influence on Europe and other parts of the world. And as we know, abortion is illegal in many countries. But I think we're sometimes, focusing too much about a private decision in the area of privacy overlooks the fact that for me it's more about equality. Only women can be pregnant, men cannot, and that breaks any sense of equality, because whether you choose to have a child, there's repercussions in your career, in your in your life generally, and if you choose not to have a child, perhaps you will excel at being chief executive of a multinational corporation.
Well, we'll get more reaction from both of you as the show goes on. After the break, non-NATO European countries such as Sweden and Finland debate whether to join NATO to defend themselves against potential Russian aggression. We discuss what this could mean. And from local elections in the UK to midterm elections upcoming in the US later this year, we ask whether voters' interests are being represented and served. All that and much more. But first, let's take a look at the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking fine for much of the country, though there will be a few showers in the north. Let's take a look at the details. Heading first to southwest England, and here, after a rather cloudy start to the day, it'll be mostly sunny to end, with generally light winds too. A similar picture over in the southeast. Plenty of late sunshine this evening, leading into a clear night, although that does mean it will turn quite chilly. There'll be patchy cloud for most of Wales this evening, but it's going to stay dry and many should have some decent sunny breaks. That's how it's also looking around the West Midlands, with some sunny spells lingering through the evening and temperatures holding up into the high teens Celsius. It should feel quite warm. There's a small chance of 1 or 2 showers around northern England this evening, but for many it will be dry with some late sunny breaks. And it will also feel cooler near the coast. There'll also be 1 or 2 showers across Scotland. Far northern and northwestern parts may be cloudier with a little bit of rain. Otherwise, there will be some sunny spells. In Northern Ireland, it's looking largely cloudy, especially in the west, where a few spots of rain are likely. The best of any late sunshine will be in the east. So wet and blustery weather will push in from the northwest overnight, whilst it will turn chilly under clear skies in the southeast. And that's how it's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christys.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christys, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Welcome back. Now, as the war in Ukraine continues, more civilians are evacuated and Western leaders meet to discuss possible further Russian sanctions. Previously neutral non-NATO European countries such as Sweden and Finland explore whether to join NATO to prevent potential future Russian aggression. In this week's Moral Dilemmas, we explore NATO and its role going forward. I'm joined now by Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, and Mary Dejevsky, former foreign correspondent in Moscow and independent columnist. Thank you both for joining me. I'll start with you, Frank. At the beginning of the invasion, some argue that the historic actions of NATO made a conflict like this, the one that we're now seeing in Ukraine, more likely. But now many accept that NATO may well be the only bulwark against Russian aggression. What do you think?
Well, you know, when the war broke out in the Ukraine, NATO was really an institution in search of a meaning, because after the Cold War, it lost its purpose. It was very much an organization that was continually looking for a reason for its existence. And somehow, Putin's action in the Ukraine created a condition where NATO was brought back to life by the events. And at the moment, NATO has taken over and playing a very important role. It should be added that when we talk about NATO, we're principally talking about the United States, because it's American power and the projection of American power through NATO that is really at issue here. And left to its devices, the European nations, with the possible exception of Britain, do not count for very much as far as the security issues are concerned in the Ukraine. What I'm really concerned about is that now that NATO has come back into life and is looking, and suddenly it feels that it's got a real mission and really means something, there's a danger that what began as a war between Russia and the Ukraine, a war for, in a sense, for the national independence of Ukraine, can get sidetracked into a global conflict between different blocs where America, through NATO, fights Russia in a kind of proxy manner, and Ukraine then becomes really a medium through which other global issues and conflicts are fought out. And that's going to be very bad for the Ukraine, because it will mean that its own aspiration for national independence may be subordinated to the logic of NATO's escalation in terms of establishing a hegemonic position within the world order.
And Mary, what do you make of the point that Frank has just made? Because Russia has repeatedly warned of, quite, serious military and political consequences that would require an adequate response should the two Nordic countries of Finland and Sweden, for example, apply to NATO membership. I mean, should we be worried that this, of Russia's statements, that this could actually cause even further escalation?
Well, I think we can actually make arguments both ways, because I think it's probably effectively a done deal that Finland and Sweden are going to be joining NATO, and probably quite soon. How much difference that actually makes to the clout of NATO, and obviously Russia will make a big deal of it, but in actual practice, those two countries have been quite sympathetic towards NATO, so it's more almost a technical issue that they will be actually inside the alliance, and that the alliance will be responsible for defending them if need be. So I think that that's on the one side. On the other side, I actually think that Frank is being expressing himself maybe very mildly and possibly too mildly, because I think that what we're already seeing is something like a proxy war between Russia and NATO. Because certainly if you look at it from Moscow's perspective, you're looking at a war that it's fighting in Ukraine, not just against Ukraine. It's fighting against a Ukraine which is being armed and has been trained by NATO. And I think this may be one of the big things that Russia underestimated when it invaded Ukraine, which obviously this was, let's make no bones about it. This was an illegal and unprovoked invasion. But the idea that Russia expected it was going to be taking on, to a degree, some of the force of NATO, I think that this was probably a big miscalculation on Russia's side.
And Frank, I mean, whilst we've kind of talked about the possible danger of reigniting Cold War antagonisms, how else can the war realistically be ended? This is, as Mary pointed out, an unprovoked, unjustified, war of aggression on the part of Russia, and only Russia realistically can end this war.
I think that's true. And I think at a certain point, Russia will realize that the costs of continuing are so high that it will withdraw, or at least it will decide to try to make some kind of a peace deal or an agreement. I think the tricky situation in this, what makes it very, very difficult, is that we're in a very fluid geopolitical situation where the United States all of a sudden finds that after decades of decline, after decades of being on retreat and being very defensive, Putin's action has given it unexpected legitimacy. And suddenly President Biden can come across as a very presidential, statesman-like individual in a way that only a few months ago would have been unthinkable. You got to remember that it was only a few months ago that you had the humiliating withdrawal of Western troops from Afghanistan, led by the Americans. And you had a whole set of setbacks and defeats globally in Syria and Libya and other places. And now all of a sudden, they're in a position where they're, in a sense, coming across as the major players. I think the problem is that what happens between America and Russia more broadly will have more of an impact on the outcome of the war in the Ukraine than simply the conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And that's really what I'm worried about. So ending the war in Ukraine ultimately depends on somehow stopping what is at the moment a hot war becoming an old traditional Cold War Mark II. And to that extent, I see a very long, protracted process coming into being where a lot of people suffer and die just because of the global uncertainties that we're faced with.
Well, thank you both. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to bring you back, Mary. Hopefully we can bring you back again on the show very soon. I have to go to the break. But thank you both for joining me this afternoon. Sociologist Frank Furedi and Mary Dejevsky, journalist and former foreign correspondent. Well, from the local elections this week in the UK and the midterms in America coming up at the later end of the year, are voters' interests being represented and served? We speak to the author of The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. And finally, we speak to two very special guests about how they are finding ways to navigate thorny moral and cultural questions in a challenging and thought-provoking way. But first, it's the latest news.
It's coming up to 34 minutes past 3. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Deputy Prime Minister has vowed to reform the Northern Ireland Protocol to improve stability in Northern Ireland following Sinn Féin's success in the Stormont elections. The party won 27 seats, overtaking the DUP, which dropped down to 25. The region has been without a power-sharing executive for several months after the DUP refused to be involved in protest over the post-Brexit protocol agreement. Senior Tories are accusing Sir Keir Starmer of hypocrisy as details emerged into allegations that he broke lockdown rules last year. The Mail on Sunday has published a leaked memo which appears to suggest that a beer and curry event attended by the Labour leader and his deputy Angela Rayner was pre-planned. Sir Keir insists that no lockdown rules were broken. However, police in Durham are investigating. He's resisting calls to resign despite previously saying that the PM should step down over parties at number 10. The Prime Minister says he'll deliver a so-called Super 7 of Brexit bills in the Queen's speech on Tuesday, which he says will cut red tape inherited from the European Union. Boris Johnson told the Sunday Express that the new laws range from data reform to financial services, allowing Britain to, quote, thrive as a modern, dynamic and independent country. He's also expected to unveil measures to help struggling town centres, including plans to force landlords to rent out empty shops. Ukrainian fighters at the besieged Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol have vowed to continue fighting as long as they are alive. The deputy commander of the regiment sheltering in the plant says they don't have much time left as they're under intense shelling. It comes as President Zelensky announced that all 300 women, children and elderly people have been rescued from the steelworks. And the United States First Lady has made a surprise trip to Ukraine, showing the US's support to the country amid Russia's invasion. Jill Biden met with Ukraine's First Lady and spoke with refugees and volunteers on the border with Slovakia. She's also expected to visit a school that's serving as a temporary shelter. You're up to date for now, but plenty more on all the main news stories at the top of the next hour. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. And just before the break, we were discussing the conflict in Ukraine and the role of NATO. And before that, we were discussing the potential overturning of Roe versus Wade, a landmark abortion case in America. I'm joined in the studio still by Tom Slater, editor of Spiked Online, and Manik Govinda, an arts curator, just to get their reaction to some of the discussions that I've just been having with the guests. I'll start with you, Tom. What do you make of the role of NATO in relation to the conflict in Ukraine and even historically and going forward?
Well, it's an interesting one because on the one hand, I have a lot of sympathy with the argument that NATO expansion over successive decades played a long role in kind of creating the situation which we find ourselves in, purely to create the kind of politics in Russia that currently exists in terms of being very anti-Western, in terms of being very hardline and all the rest of it. But what I think has been demonstrated here is that fundamentally, first of all, as soon as Russia invades a sovereign nation, it's clear who is...
It's a huge escalation.
It's an incredible escalation, which it pales into insignificance with the quite thoughtless and blundering way in which NATO was expanding into Eastern Europe in recent years. But the other thing is that whilst it's interesting is the fact that whilst NATO is kind of supposedly rejuvenated itself through this whole crisis, there's still a lot of dissension within the NATO countries itself. Hungary don't want to touch this war whatsoever on one extreme, and then of course you've got America and Britain leading the pack in the other direction, Germany somewhere in the middle. So NATO as an organisation definitely has got this new lease on life, but at the same time that the fundamental problems with it, that it's a kind of old Cold War relic, remain because it doesn't really properly fit around the kind of the views of all of the constituent members, if you like.
And what do you think, Manik, about that point, about the danger of reasserting Cold War antagonism? Because it is true that actually it is America and also to some extent Britain that will be, dominating NATO. And do we really want society or the international community to go into these kinds of blocks once again? Is that really helpful for international peace going forward?
I think we mustn't overlook the fact that Europe, the continent of Europe, is also very involved in what's going on. You've got neighbouring countries like Finland, neighbouring Russia. You have Poland neighbouring Ukraine. So those are kind of very significant countries that are involved, and their points of view on the war are very important to acknowledge. So yes, while NATO seems to be very much the arm of the USA and Britain secondary, those kind of Central and Eastern European countries and North European countries, Scandinavian countries, it's very important to hear their voice too. We mustn't overlook that.
No, absolutely. I'm just going to bring in some views that have been sent in. Chris Masters said, those who are worried about the type of escalation in Ukraine must answer one simple question. What is their red line? Chemical weapons, tactical nukes, genocide. When does escalation become morally and practically essential? I mean, I think that is a very interesting point from Chris, because I think that I don't want to say cowardice, but there has, or seemingly, some anxiety about intervening or doing anything more to defend Ukraine because of Russia's threats of nuclear escalation. But in some senses, that could almost give Russia a green light to do whatever, as long as they put a threat forward of nuclear.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, are we going to get into a situation where, because Russia brandishes its nuclear weapons, we therefore allow it to do whatever it wants? I can understand why people are concerned. We should box clever with anything this potentially dangerous for not just for the countries involved currently, but the world in general. But we also have to remember who is escalating this, who invaded a sovereign nation, who is currently brandishing nuclear weapons and playing propaganda videos in which Britain and Ireland are wiped off the map. So in this argument about who's escalating what, the West should tread more carefully, we've got to remember who started this in the first place.
But Manik, some people will say, but there is a problem of our political class. Can we trust our political class to be able to think strategically, morally, principally, when it comes to an international conflict? When you see the gaffes and blunders of Joe Biden and so on, it doesn't necessarily give people confidence to think that if we did intervene or escalate in any way, that it will be done in a way that would be sophisticated or long-term in its thinking, given what we saw in Afghanistan.
Well, yes, I mean, there is a point that it's deflecting the issues and problems that we face at home, whether that's in the USA or the UK. And a conflict abroad will always bring a new kind of language into political discourse. But I think at this point we do have to stand with the leaders in terms of how it's supporting Ukraine against, essentially, in my opinion, the greater evil, which is Putin's Russia and its military aggression.
No, interesting. And just reading a few more views, Ian Wiggins said, a bloke has no right to determine what a woman wishes, and mentioning the Pope is ridiculous. A man who has no perception of the real world, family, life and children. That's a perspective. Also, another person has said, I really fear that the UK may once again be importing the extremes of American politics. In Britain, we have a sensible level of agreement and compromise on this issue. I hope it stays that way. And Colin has also said, according to Islam, abortion is allowable up to the beginning of the 4th month. And basically putting in a different perspective that actually even in other religions, such as Islam, for example, that abortion is allowed. So very interesting perspectives. Please continue to send your views. Well, also this week saw voters in the UK go to the polls for the local elections, but with low voter turnout and no one party able to claim a definitive victory overall, there is a sense that voters are becoming frustrated with the political status quo, but lack a clear vehicle to change it. As the midterm elections also rapidly approach across the pond in the US, are voters' interests being represented and served? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now, very shortly, with Joel Kopkin, author and fellow in urban studies at Chapman University. Thank you so much, Joel, for joining me. First, I'll start with that question that I said in the introduction. I mean, do you think that voters' interests in the US are being represented and served as we approach the midterms later in the year?
Well, I think the focus has been on what you might call peripheral issues in terms of the everyday life, the Ukraine war being part of that. And, as terrible as it is, I don't think it's the number one concern of the voters. I think the voters are concerned, and I don't think abortion is their big concern. I think they're concerned about things like inflation, the fact that the economy does not seem to be doing particularly well. I think that they're concerned about things like not being able to buy a house, pay the rent, and neither party is really focused on this. They just sort of point fingers at each other, but fundamentally they want to work on these other issues which excite their base, whether it's the sort of Trump claims about the election, or it's about abortion, or it's about CRT, critical race theory. These are not insignificant issues, but I think the real issues that people care about, and this has been true for most of American politics, are economic, and neither party seems to be addressing it. The Biden administration seems to be in some sort of weird space that has very little to do with reality, as they've been completely sideswiped by the inflation. And the Republicans really don't have much to say except, oh, it's your fault.
And what do you think voters can do about this then? If the question of kind of how culture has become politicised isn't necessarily what's going to bring bread and butter to the table. I mean, what can voters do you think, in order to advocate for their material interests?
Well, I think what they have to do is they have to be very clear about, who's policies are going to help them more than others. I think, which policies are going to promote economic growth. It's very interesting to me. Neither party really has a strong economic growth agenda. Republicans, at least, aren't opposed to it. The problem the Democrats have is you cannot have economic growth and essentially the Green New Deal at the same time. It just, because essentially and this is really a problem the Democrats have, which is, they have historically been the party of the working class, like the Labour Party in the UK. They've been losing that vote in part because they have endorsed not only sort of some radical social ideas, but because fundamentally the Green New Deal basically is we have to reduce the economy, reduce the standard of living, have people live in apartments and ride the bus instead of living in houses and drive cars. I would put that proposition up in front of the American people, and the vast majority are going to vote for a single family house and a car than riding the bus to work. This is a very, very big country. Distances are greater. We're used to a certain level of freedom, maybe an excess of freedom, but we're used to them. And people in the middle and working classes in this country historically are not likely to be satisfied saying, well, maybe you'll do a little bit worse than your parents. I don't think that's acceptable to most voters. And whichever party can capture the aspirations of that middle class, I think that's the party that's going to do well. And right now, neither party's ready to do that.
Well, we will be keeping a very close eye on how all of that develops. Thank you so much, Joel, for joining me this afternoon. Joel Kotkin, author and fellow in urban studies at Chapman University. Before we just go on to the last segment, I just wanted to get your reaction to the local elections, Tom, because, hearing some of the things that Joel has just said there about, a sense of kind of frustration. None of the parties seem to be speaking to those real material issues. We have, in many senses, a similar problem here in the UK. We've had this local election. No one party's been, definitive in its victory. And it does seem that, to really transform the country economically and socially, who do you really vote for?
I think that's exactly it. I mean, who could say that going into this local election that either of the parties had some sort of credible platform to dig us out of the hole that we're in? The Labour Party can go on about a windfall tax, but that's really not going to tackle what we're talking about. I think the Tories might end up stealing it at some point anyway, given it's not a particularly radical proposition. And so then what you end up falling back on is all the problems the Labour Party's had for the longest time with its old heartlands, with its kind of inability to cut through. And I think what we've seen is that Keir Starmer really wanted to just ride scandals all the way to number 10 and just pose as Captain Sensible, and I'm really incredibly ethical by contrast. But first of all, it's not a very enticing proposition in and of itself, but also it's just gone to show that you can have all these scandals in the world. If you don't have an answer to the question of how you're going to reconnect with those voters and how you're going to make their lives better, you're on a hide into nothing, obviously.
No, absolutely. Well, and finally today, we asked, how do we navigate complex and thorny moral and cultural issues in a challenging and thought-provoking way? How do we build relationships and exchange ideas across geographical, political and national divides? And what role can art and culture play in all of this? I'm delighted to be joined, still in the studio, by Manik Govinda and Anetska Kolek to tell us about Culture Tensions, a Poland-based event series which seeks to explore these questions. Thank you both for joining me. Firstly, I'll start with you, Manik. Could you just tell our audience a bit more about this event series, what you're trying to do and what they can expect if they want to go?
Sure. So it's a series of debates taking place in Poland at the amazing Ujazdowski Castle Centre for Contemporary Art. It's Poland's equivalent of Tate Britain or the South Bank Centre. It's absolutely beautiful gallery and museum. So the discussions, firstly, the museum, the gallery has been at the forefront of really tackling about what is political art, and not political art that just fits in with the progressive left agenda, but actually political art, as it says on the tin, across all spectrums. So it had a very powerful exhibition summer last year. I was invited to give a talk on cancel culture, and then proposed a series of further debates and conversations, public discussions, where art and politics and moral issues and philosophical issues meet. And we know that art across centuries has always done that. It's interpreted, it's reflected, it's tackled very strong, important social and political issues.
And it's, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. So I just wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously Manik is based in the UK, and looking at the some of the contributors and speakers, there's many UK-based thinkers there. I mean, why did you want to collaborate with the UK in terms of developing this event series and asking these kinds of questions?
So I've lived in London for 20 years, and for the last 13 years, I've been curating and co-organizing art festival called Passion for Freedom. And through this work, I've seen that a lot of artists are self-censoring themselves. At first, it was just few issues, and now with each year, it seems the list gets longer. And it's not only artists anymore, but also just everyday person censors what they talk about at work or among friends during the dinner party. So I moved back to Poland at the end of last year. I just found difficult dealing with the censorship in Britain, and also I survived a terror attack in 2015 in Copenhagen. So each new terror attack in Britain was really affecting my health. So we think that this platform is a great way to bring international artists into subjects that are vital for development of our societies and individuals. And we don't shy away from subjects that might be difficult, but also that they seemed to be superficially presented as black and white. And they also seem to be pitting people against each other, where we want to bring more nuance, we want to bring a different perspective. In January, we tackled art and migration, and we had 3 artists from Passion for Freedom invited to come and join us: Miriam Elia, Firuzeh Bazrafkan from Denmark, and Taslim Mulhal. And then in March, we had a discussion on the sacred and the profane, where is it positioned within culture and art, and also looking how it seems that this is something that quite a lot of people are afraid to discuss among friends and publicly, because it seems that if you believe in something that is not just materialistic or nihilistic, you might be seen as kind of old style, old school. And this time round, we're talking about the women's right to choose. And here, as the subject is being politicized, we're trying to find this middle ground and also look at different aspects, whether artists only look at it from this position that it's already settled, or actually there's more nuance to that.
Well, really fascinating. And finally, to you, Manik, I mean, what are you hoping to achieve from these public discussions?
Well, I think it's really inspiring that what the Ujazdowski is doing, and we need more of this in the UK. I think some of the major institutions are shying away from, as Agnieszka said, very important issues which are not black and white. There's no good and bad in some of those positions, but it is about having the complex debate which does not alienate the public, really. And I think what we're trying to do is reflect public discourse through art and cultural discussions.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm very delighted that the discussion, this show, is a media partner to Culture Tension. So please do check it out and find out more, because it looks set to be and has already been a fascinating and challenging discussion. I just want to thank Tom Slater, editor of Spiked Online, for joining me today, and also you, Manik Govinda, arts consultant, and also Agnieszka Kolek, artist and curator. Thank you all for joining me on the programme. That's all from us on the discussion this afternoon. See you at the same time next week. Up next is Nana Queer.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking fine for much of the country, though there will be a few showers in the north. Let's take a look at the details. Heading first to southwest England, and here, after a rather cloudy start to the day, it'll be mostly sunny to end, with generally light winds too. A similar picture over in the southeast. Plenty of late sunshine this evening, leading into a clear night, although that does mean it will turn quite chilly. There'll be patchy cloud for most of Wales this evening, but it's going to stay dry, and many should have some decent sunny breaks. That's how it's also looking around the West Midlands, with some sunny spells lingering through the evening and temperatures holding up into the high teens Celsius. It should feel quite warm. There's a small chance of 1 or 2 showers around northern England this evening, but for many it will be dry with some late sunny breaks. And it will also feel cooler near the coast.